A baby left at a church door in the dead of winter. A reverend with no children of his own. What he decides that night will change both of their lives forever. But what happens when the past returns to their doorstep years later? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. Winter had settled harshly over Oak Ridge, Colorado. In January of 1878, the small mining town nestled in the mountains was blanketed in snow, with icicles hanging from the eaves of wooden buildings like frozen tears. Reverend Thomas Miller, a man of 45 years with graying temples and kind eyes, had just finished his evening prayers in the modest wooden church that served as the heart of the community. As he moved to extinguish the lanterns, a strange sound caught his attention. A muffled cry carried on the bitter wind. Opening the heavy oak door, the Reverend peered into the darkness, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. There, nestled in a small wooden basket on the church steps, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a threadbare blanket. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, kneeling to investigate. Inside the bundle was a baby girl, no more than a few days old, her tiny face red from the cold. A small note was pinned to the blanket. "Please care for my daughter. Her name is Elizabeth. I cannot provide for her." Thomas gathered the child into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he hurried back inside the church. "Don't you worry, little one," he murmured, moving toward the small room at the back that served as both his office and living quarters. "God has brought you to me for a reason." The Reverend had lost his wife to tuberculosis 5 years earlier. They had dreamed of filling their home with children, but fate had denied them that blessing. Now, as he gently placed the infant on his bed and stoked the fire to warm the room, he felt a long-dormant spark of purpose ignite within him. "Elizabeth," he tested the name on his tongue. "Elizabeth Miller. That sounds just right, doesn't it?" The baby's cries softened as the room grew warmer. Thomas dipped a clean cloth in water and dabbed at her tiny lips, wondering what circumstances had led to her abandonment. "I should take you to the sheriff in the morning," he said, more to himself than to the child. "They might know of a family that could take you in." But as the night wore on and Thomas sat beside the makeshift crib he had fashioned from a drawer, watching the steady rise and fall of Elizabeth's chest, he felt something shift inside him. By morning, his decision was made. "I found her on the church steps," Thomas explained to Sheriff Wilson, who stood examining the note left with the child. "She was nearly frozen through." The sheriff, a burly man with a thick mustache, frowned. "Probably some miner's girl who got herself in trouble. We can send word to Denver about an orphan, but it might be weeks before anyone comes to collect her." Thomas straightened his shoulders. "That won't be necessary. I intend to raise her myself." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "You, Reverend? Single man raising a baby girl? The town won't take kindly to that arrangement." "Then I'll have to change their minds," Thomas replied firmly. "This child was left at God's house, and I believe He meant for me to find her. I won't abandon her to some orphanage." In the days that followed, Thomas faced skepticism from his congregation. Whispers followed him as he carried Elizabeth to church services, her tiny form bundled against his chest. "A man can't raise a girl child alone," Martha Stevens, the town's most outspoken widow, declared after Sunday service. "It simply isn't proper." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "With respect, Mrs. Stevens, I believe I'm capable of providing a loving home for Elizabeth. And I'm not too proud to ask for help when needed." Martha's expression softened slightly. "Well, she need proper clothes. And you'll have no idea how to handle things when she gets older." Thomas smiled. "Then perhaps you might consider offering your guidance from time to time." By spring, the initial controversy had faded. Elizabeth became a fixture in Thomas's life and in the church. He constructed a small cradle that sat beside the pulpit during services, and his sermons often took on a new dimension as he reflected on the lessons of parenthood. "Faith," he told his congregation one Sunday, with Elizabeth sleeping peacefully nearby, "is much like raising a child. It requires patience, commitment, and the humility to learn as you go. This little one has taught me more about God's love in 3 months than I learned in 45 years. As winter melted into spring and Elizabeth grew stronger each day, Thomas often stood at the church door at sunset, wondering about the woman who had left her daughter there on that frigid January night. "Whoever you are," he whispered to the horizon, "I promise to care for her as my own. She never want for love in this life, that I swear to you." 12 years passed like the changing seasons, each one bringing new joys and challenges to Thomas and Elizabeth's life together. The girl had blossomed into a bright, curious child with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and a spirit that seemed to radiate warmth to everyone she encountered. "Papa, look," Elizabeth called, bursting through the church doors one autumn afternoon in 1890. She held a small leather-bound book clutched to her chest, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mr. Barnett at the general store gave me this journal. He said I write so well, I ought to have a proper place to put my stories." Thomas looked up from the sermon he was preparing, his heart swelling with pride. Elizabeth had shown a remarkable gift for words from the moment she began to speak. Her imagination seemed boundless, crafting tales that captivated not only him but the entire town. "That was mighty generous of him," Thomas replied, setting aside his papers. "Though I suspect he's hoping to read your next story about the brave sheriff and the mountain lion." Elizabeth grinned, revealing a missing tooth that made her look even more endearing. "I already promised Mrs. Stevens she'd get the first reading. She's teaching me to make apple preserves tomorrow, and she said we could write down the recipe too." Thomas marveled at how completely Elizabeth had been embraced by the community that had once questioned her place among them. Martha Stevens, once his harshest critic, had become Elizabeth's surrogate grandmother, teaching her all the domestic arts a growing girl should know. "Papa," Elizabeth said, her tone suddenly serious as she perched on the edge of his desk. "Sarah Jenkins asked me today about my real mother." Thomas felt his heart constrict. Though he had never hidden the circumstances of finding Elizabeth, the questions had been coming more frequently as she grew older. "What did you tell her?" he asked gently. "I told her you're my real father, even if another woman gave birth to me." Elizabeth's brow furrowed, but then I started wondering. "Do you think she ever thinks about me? My birth mother, I mean." Thomas reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind Elizabeth's ear. "I believe she thinks of you every day. I believe leaving you was the hardest thing she ever did, and that she hoped you would find a good life. Do you think she knows I did? Find a good life, I mean." "I pray she does," Thomas answered honestly. "And I thank her in my prayers each night for the gift she gave me." Elizabeth seemed satisfied with this answer, at least for the moment. She hopped down from the desk and spun around, her calico dress twirling around her legs. "I'm going to write a story about her. I'll make her beautiful and brave, like a princess from a fairy tale." Thomas smiled, though his heart ached. "That sounds wonderful, Lizzie. Now why don't you help me ring the bell for evening prayers?" Later that night, after Elizabeth had gone to bed in the small room Thomas had built onto the back of the church, as she outgrew sharing his quarters, the reverend sat alone in the sanctuary. The moonlight filtered through the simple stained glass window, casting colorful shadows across the wooden pews. "Lord," he prayed softly, "give me the wisdom to guide her through the questions that will come. Help me to be enough for her, even as she wonders about the parts of herself that came from elsewhere." The following spring brought tragedy to Oak Ridge when influenza swept through the town. Thomas worked tirelessly, moving from home to offer comfort to the sick and last rites to the dying. He had insisted Elizabeth stay with Martha Stevens during this time, hoping to keep her safe from the disease, but God's plans did not align with his own. On a rainy Tuesday in April, Martha sent word that Elizabeth had fallen ill. Thomas abandoned the sermon he'd been writing and raced through the muddy streets to Martha's cottage on the edge of town. Elizabeth lay small and fragile beneath a pile of quilts, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored. Thomas fell to his knees beside her bed, taking her hot hand in his. "Papa," she whispered, her voice raspy, You shouldn't be here. You'll get sick too. Hush now, he soothed, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. There's nowhere else I should be but with you. For 3 days and nights, Thomas maintained his vigil, barely sleeping, praying constantly as Elizabeth's fever raged. Martha brought broth and tea, her own face lined with worry. You should rest, Reverend, she urged on the 3rd night. You'll be no good to her if you fall ill yourself. I can't leave her, Thomas replied, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. I won't. In the darkest hour before dawn, Elizabeth's fever broke. Thomas, who had finally dozed off in the chair beside her bed, woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time in days. Papa, she said softly, I had the strangest dream. A woman was singing to me. She had hair like mine, and she told me it wasn't my time yet. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. It was just the fever, Lizzie, he said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Maybe, Elizabeth said, a small smile playing on her lips. Or maybe my mother was watching. Over me too, just like you. As Elizabeth recovered her strength over the following weeks, Thomas found himself contemplating mortality in a way he never had before. He was no longer a young man, now approaching 60, and the influenza outbreak had claimed several of his contemporaries. Elizabeth needs more than just me, he confided to Dr. Wilson during a checkup. She needs a future, security I can't provide forever. You're speaking as though you're at death's door, Thomas, the doctor replied, frowning. You're hale and hearty for a man your age. Nevertheless, Thomas insisted. I need to make provisions. She's a bright girl. She deserves an education, opportunities beyond what Oak Ridge can offer. That summer, Thomas made arrangements for Elizabeth to attend a boarding school for girls in Denver when she turned 14. Though the cost would strain his modest savings, he believed it was what her mother would have wanted for her daughter. 2 more years, he told Elizabeth as they sat on the church steps watching the summer storm roll in over the mountains. 2 more years, and you'll be off to Denver to learn from real teachers, not just your old papa and his books. Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder. I don't want to leave you, she said quietly. You won't be leaving me, Thomas assured her. You'll be taking the first steps toward becoming the remarkable woman you're meant to be. And I'll be right here, waiting for your letters and counting the days until your visit's home. As lightning split the sky and thunder rumbled through the valley, Thomas sent a silent prayer of gratitude to the woman who had left her precious daughter in his care all those years ago. Wherever she was, he hoped she would approve of the choices he had made. September 1894 arrived with a Christmas in the air that signaled summer's end. Elizabeth, now 16 and home from her 2nd year at Miss Porter's School for Young Ladies in Denver, sat on a blanket beneath the old oak tree behind the church, a book open in her lap. Thomas watched her from the back door, struck by how quickly she was becoming a young woman. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned up in the latest fashion, and the simple blue dress she wore, one she had made herself, highlighted the graceful figure. She was developing. But more than her physical changes, Thomas noted the confidence in her posture, the thoughtful expression that often crossed her face as she read or wrote in her journals. A penny for your thoughts, he called, making his way across the yard with 2 cups of tea balanced on a small tray. Elizabeth looked up, smiling in that way that still made his heart swell with love and pride. I was just thinking about what Miss Abernathy said about women's suffrage. She believes we'll see women voting in our lifetime. Thomas settled onto the blanket beside her, handing her a steaming cup. And what do you think about that? I think it's only right, Elizabeth replied, her tone matter of fact. Miss Abernathy says women bring a different perspective to governance, more focused on the welfare of families and communities. Sounds like Miss Abernathy has made quite an impression on you, Thomas observed, blowing on his tea to cool it. She has, Elizabeth admitted. She says I have a talent for persuasive writing. She thinks I could work for a newspaper someday. Or even write books. She hesitated, then added, that is, if I don't get married right away. Thomas studied his daughter's face. Is that what you want? To write for a living? I don't know yet, Elizabeth said honestly. Sometimes I think I'd like to travel, see more of the world before settling down. Other times. Her voice trailed off and a slight blush colored her cheeks. Other times? Thomas prompted gently. Well, there's a boy, a young man, really, Joseph Crawford. His father owns a publishing house in Denver. Joseph wants to be a lawyer, to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. The blush deepened. He's been writing to me. Thomas felt a strange mixture of emotions, a father's instinctive protectiveness, pride in the young woman Elizabeth was becoming, and a bittersweet acknowledgement that she was forging her own path in the world. And does this Joseph Crawford have honorable intentions? He asked, trying to keep his tone light. Elizabeth laughed. Papa, we've only exchanged a few letters, but ... She hesitated. He's asked permission to call on me when I return to school. Miss Porter oversees all visitors, of course. Thomas nodded, relieved at the school's strict chaperoning. Well, I suppose I should like to meet this young man at some point. You will, Elizabeth assured him. He's very respectful, and he asks about you in every letter. He says any man who would raise a child not his own must have exceptional character. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. Even after all these years, references to Elizabeth's origins could still catch him off guard. You're every bit my daughter, Lizzie. Never doubt that. I don't, she said softly, reaching to squeeze his hand. But lately, I've been thinking more about her, my birth mother. Do you think I'll ever know why she left me? Thomas sighed, setting down his tea. They'd had variations of this conversation over the years, but Elizabeth's questions had become more nuanced as she matured. I wish I could give you answers, he said honestly. All I know is what was in that note, and that she left you where she knew you'd be found and cared for. That suggests to me she loved you very much, even though she couldn't keep you. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you still have it? The note, I mean. Thomas nodded. It's in my Bible, where it's always been. May I see it? I don't think I've looked at it since I was 12. Thomas hesitated only briefly before rising. Wait here, he said, making his way back to the church, dotting his small study. He carefully opened the worn leather Bible that had been his companion for nearly 40 years. Between the pages of Psalms lay a yellowed piece of paper, the ink faded, but still legible. Thomas ran his thumb over the careful handwriting before returning to Elizabeth. She took the note reverently, studying the delicate script. Her handwriting is beautiful, she murmured. She was educated. Thomas hadn't considered that before, but Elizabeth was right. The penmanship displayed a level of refinement unusual for a desperate young woman in a mining town. Please care for my daughter. Her name is Elizabeth. I cannot provide for her. Elizabeth read aloud. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears. It's so brief, so ... final. Perhaps she couldn't bear to write more, Thomas suggested gently. Elizabeth carefully folded the note and handed it back. Sometimes I imagine she watches me from afar, that she's seen me grow up. Is that foolish? Not at all, Thomas replied, thinking of his own similar fantasies over the years. I've often hoped she somehow knows how wonderful you've turned out. They sat in companionable silence as the afternoon light filtered through the oak leaves, casting dappled shadows across the blanket. Finally, Elizabeth spoke again. I've made a decision, Papa. After I finish at Miss Porter's next spring, I want to come home for a while before deciding what's next. The school has offered me a position as a junior teacher in English composition, but I'm not sure that's my path. Thomas felt a selfish surge of joy at the prospect of having Elizabeth home again, even temporarily. You know you're always welcome here, but I don't want you to limit yourself on my account. It's not just for you, Elizabeth assured him. I need time to think, to write, to figure out what I truly want. And ... double quote, she hesitated. I thought perhaps we might try to learn more about my mother. There must be records, people who remember. Thomas tensed slightly. Over the years, he had made discreet inquiries, but Oak Ridge was a transient mining community. People came and went, and few remembered the winter of 1878 with any clarity. "We can try," he said cautiously. "But Lizzie, I don't want you to be disappointed if we learn nothing new." "I understand," she replied, "but I need to try. I have so many questions, not just about her, but about myself too." Later that evening, as Thomas prepared for bed, he found himself standing before the small dresser drawer where he kept his most precious possessions. Alongside his wedding ring from his brief marriage and a lock of his wife's hair was a tiny knitted cap, the one Elizabeth had been wearing when he found her. He had never shown it to her, unsure if it would bring comfort or pain. Now he wondered if it might be time to share this last tangible connection to her origins. A sudden knock at the church door interrupted his thoughts. Frowning, it was well past 9 o'clock. Thomas set the cap aside and went to investigate. Standing on the church steps was a woman he didn't recognize, bundled against the early autumn chill. She was perhaps in her late 30s, with dark hair streaked with gray, and a face that bore the marks of a difficult life. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, instinctively reaching to light the lantern by the door. The woman stepped back as the light illuminated her features. "Forgive me, Reverend," she said, her voice cultured despite her worn appearance. "I've come a long way. I'm looking for ... She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "I'm looking for information about a baby that might have been left at this church many years ago." Thomas felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath him. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't move. "A baby girl," the woman continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her name would have been Elizabeth." Thomas gripped the doorframe for support. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The woman lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "My name is Catherine Harrington, and I believe you've been raising my daughter." Thomas felt as though time had stopped. The woman Catherine stood before him, her expression a complex mixture of hope, fear, and determination. Behind him, in the small bedroom off the sanctuary, Elizabeth slept, unaware that her world was about to change forever. "You'd better come in," he said finally, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. He stepped aside, allowing Catherine to enter the church. She moved with a deliberate grace that reminded him eerily of Elizabeth, taking in the simple beauty of the sanctuary with wide eyes. "It's just as I remembered," she murmured. Thomas led her to his small study, lighting additional lamps to dispel the shadows. In the better light, he could see their resemblance more clearly, the same auburn hair, though Catherine's was streaked with gray, the same delicate chin and high cheekbones. "Please sit," he offered, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. He remained standing, feeling an irrational need to maintain some advantage in this unexpected confrontation. "How did you find us?" he asked, his mind racing with implications. Catherine settled into the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It wasn't difficult. Oak Ridge isn't so large that news doesn't travel. I've heard stories over the years of the Reverend who raised a foundling girl as his own." Her voice caught. "I just never had the courage to come before now." "Why now?" Thomas demanded, more harshly than he intended. "It's been 16 years. Catherine flinched slightly, but met his gaze. "Because I'm dying, Reverend Miller. Consumption. The doctors give me perhaps 6 months." She drew a shaky breath. "I couldn't go to my grave without seeing her, without knowing she's well." Thomas felt his anger deflate, replaced by a complicated sympathy. He sank into his chair, suddenly aware of the weight of his 62 years. "She's flourishing," he said quietly. "She's brilliant, compassionate, full of life. Everything a father could hope for in a daughter." Tears filled Catherine's eyes. "You've been her father in every way that matters. I've always been grateful for that, even from afar. You've been watching us?" Thomas asked, unsettled by the thought. "Not directly," Catherine clarified. "But I made inquiries over the years. I knew she was attending school in Denver. I knew she was happy." She hesitated. "Does she know about being found?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "I've never hidden it from her. She's been asking more questions lately, trying to understand why she was left." "And what have you told her?" The truth that I found her on the church steps with only a note giving her name. That whoever left her there must have loved her very much to ensure she would be found and cared for. Thomas leaned forward. But you could tell her yourself. The rest of the truth, Catherine paled. I didn't come here to disrupt her life. I only wanted to see her, perhaps from a distance. To carry that memory with me at the end. Thomas studied the woman before him. Despite her illness, there was a dignity about her, an intelligence in her eyes that he recognized from Elizabeth. What is the rest of the truth, Catherine? Elizabeth deserves to know. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands. Finally she spoke. I was 19 when she was born, the daughter of a wealthy banker in Denver. I fell in love with a young man my father disapproved of, a teacher with progressive ideas, but no fortune or family connections. A sad smile touched her lips. He was brilliant, idealistic. He wanted to change the world through education. Elizabeth's father, Thomas said softly. Catherine nodded. James. When my father discovered our relationship, he was furious. He sent me away to stay with relatives in Boston, not realizing I was already carrying James's child. Her voice grew distant with memory. I managed to hide my condition for several months, but eventually, they discovered the truth. My father gave me an ultimatum: give up the baby for adoption to a family of his choosing and return to Denver with my reputation intact, or be disowned entirely. But you didn't do either, Thomas observed. No, Catherine agreed. I couldn't bear the thought of my child being raised by strangers, chosen by my father, people who would never tell her of her origins, who might not love her as their own. So I fled. I made my way back west, hoping to find James. Her voice broke, but when I reached Denver, I learned he had died. Typhoid fever had swept through the school where he taught. Thomas felt a deep ache of sympathy. So you came to Oak Ridge. I had a distant cousin here, Catherine explained. I thought she might help me, but when I arrived, I discovered she had moved on months earlier. I was alone, my funds nearly exhausted, with a newborn and winter setting in. She looked up, her eyes pleading for understanding. I watched this church for days. I saw how you were with your congregation, your kindness, your compassion. I prayed you would show that same compassion to my daughter. Why didn't you come forward before now? Thomas asked, the question that had been burning in his mind. Catherine sighed heavily. At first, it was fear that my father would find us, fear that I couldn't provide the life Elizabeth deserved. Later it was shame, and then she trailed off, looking around the study at the books, the simple but comfortable furnishings. Then I saw how well she was thriving with you, and I couldn't bear to disrupt that happiness. A soft creak from the doorway made them both turn. Elizabeth stood there in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale with shock. Lizzie, Thomas breathed, rising quickly. I heard voices, Elizabeth said, her gaze fixed on Catherine. I thought perhaps someone needed help. Catherine had gone completely still, her eyes drinking in the sight of her daughter. Elizabeth, she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. Elizabeth took a hesitant step forward, her analytical mind clearly making connections. You're her, aren't you? You're my mother. Catherine nodded, seemingly unable to speak. Elizabeth turned to Thomas, her expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. Did you know she was coming? No, Thomas answered honestly. This is as much a surprise to me as it is to you. Elizabeth returned her attention to Catherine, studying her with an intensity that reminded Thomas of how she approached her studies. Why did you leave me? She asked directly, her voice remarkably steady. Catherine rose slowly from her chair, her movements cautious as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I left you because I loved you too much to let my father control your future, and because I couldn't provide for you myself. Your father, Elizabeth repeated. My grandfather. Is he still alive? No, Catherine replied. He passed away 5 years ago. Elizabeth nodded, processing this. And my father, my birth father? His name was James Elliot, Catherine said softly. He was a teacher, brilliant and kind. He died before you were born. But you have his eyes and his love of words, it seems. Thomas watched as Elizabeth absorbed this information, recognizing the thoughtful expression that meant she was fitting pieces together in her mind. You're ill, Elizabeth stated rather than asked, her observant eyes noting Catherine's too thin frame, the pallor beneath her complexion. Catherine nodded. Consumption. It's why I finally found the courage to come. I couldn't leave this world without seeing you one more time. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between Catherine and Thomas. Then, with a grace that made Thomas's heart swell with pride, she crossed the room and took Catherine's hands in hers. Thank you, Elizabeth said simply. For giving me life. For making sure I would be found by someone who would love me. She glanced at Thomas, her eyes shining with tears. I've had a wonderful father. I've been blessed. Catherine's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face. You're everything I could have hoped for, she whispered. More than I dreamed. Thomas felt his own eyes grow damp as he watched the two women, so alike in ways neither had known until this moment. He cleared his throat. It's late, he said gently. Catherine, where are you staying? The boarding house on Main Street, she replied, reluctantly releasing Elizabeth's hands. Nonsense, Elizabeth declared, with the decisiveness that always reminded Thomas of himself at his most stubborn. You'll stay here. We have a small guest room that Papa uses for visiting preachers. It's yours for as long as you need it. Thomas nodded in agreement, though his mind was racing with the implications. Elizabeth is right. You shouldn't be alone at the boarding house. Catherine looked between them, her expression one of wonder. You would welcome me, just like that, after what I did? You gave me life twice, Elizabeth said softly. Once when you bore me, and again when you placed me where Papa would find me. How could I not welcome you? Later that night, after Catherine had been settled in the guest room, Thomas found Elizabeth sitting in the sanctuary, her gaze fixed on the stained glass window that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Are you all right? He asked, settling beside her in the pew. I'm not sure, she answered honestly. It's a lot to take in. All these years, I've imagined her, created stories about who she might be, and now she's here, in the next room. She turned to Thomas, her expression troubled. She's dying, isn't she? Thomas nodded, seeing no point in shielding her from this truth. Yes, but you have time to know her, to ask your questions, to form memories. And you? Elizabeth asked, studying his face. How do you feel about all this? Thomas considered the question carefully, surprised, a bit overwhelmed, but also grateful. Grateful that you'll have answers I couldn't give you. Grateful to finally meet the woman who trusted me with her most precious treasure. Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder, just as she had done as a child. You'll always be my father, she said firmly. Nothing changes that. Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I know, Lizzie, nothing could. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality. Catherine grew stronger temporarily, the mountain air and the joy of being with Elizabeth seeming to grant her a brief reprieve from her illness. She shared stories of James, of her own childhood, filling in the blank spaces of Elizabeth's history. Thomas watched them together, heads bent over a book, laughing at shared observations. Catherine teaching Elizabeth a song her own mother had sung, and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was joy in seeing Elizabeth's happiness, in witnessing the completion of a circle begun 16 years ago. But there was also a quiet sorrow, an acknowledgement that their small family had changed irrevocably. On a crisp October evening, as the three of them sat on the church steps watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Catherine reached out, taking one of Thomas's hands and one of Elizabeth's in her own. I want you both to know, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days, that finding you together, seeing the family you've built, has brought me more peace than I ever thought possible. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. You gave me the greatest gift of my life, he said simply. I've tried every day to be worthy of it. "You've succeeded," Catherine assured him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "More than succeeded." Elizabeth, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke. "Up. I've been thinking about what happens next." She looked at Catherine. "I want to stay here with both of you, for as long as we have together. My studies can wait." Catherine shook her head. "No, Elizabeth. Your education is everything your father and I would have wanted for you. Thomas has made that possible, and you mustn't interrupt your path." "But," Elizabeth began to protest. "Your mother is right," Thomas interjected gently. "But perhaps there's a compromise. Miss Porter's is only a day's journey away. You could return to school, and we could arrange visits." Elizabeth considered this, her practical nature asserting itself. "I suppose that could work, and I could write every day if you wish." Catherine smiled, though the effort clearly cost her. "I would like that very much." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 16 years ago, a desperate young woman had left her child on these very steps, never imagining that one day they would sit here together, bound by love that transcended blood and time. "Look," Elizabeth said softly, pointing to the evening star that shone particularly bright above the church spire. "Papa always told me that star was watching over me, even when I couldn't see it. I think perhaps it was guiding us all along, leading us back to each other." Thomas met Catherine's gaze over Elizabeth's head, seeing in her eyes the same thought that had occurred to him in finding each other again. They had all found a measure of grace that few are granted in this life. "Yes," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "I believe it was."